All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, here we go. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Sarah Salter Kelly. Sarah, welcome.
Welcome. Good to be here today, Guy. I'm really excited.
Thank you so much. So Sarah is the author of the book Trauma as Medicine, in which she shares her experience of her mother's kidnapping and homicide as a template to support others in moving into the underworld territory of trauma. She offers foundational teachings to guide individuals in trusting that not only do they have the right life experiences, they also have the right resources within themselves to address them and transform them. Years of training in spiritual healing and personal growth, as well as a focus on earth-based traditions, enable Sarah to present a guide to freedom, compassion, and authentic forgiveness. All right, Sarah, welcome once again. Before we get going, share with our listeners where you are from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah, I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and I lived there for 44 years. And about 2.5 years ago, right before the pandemic, I decided to do some midlife change with my husband and I and last kid at home. And we moved to the southern interior of BC, so Grand Forks, BC.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
So let's dive in here. How did this happen? How is it that we have come here right now and we're talking? What brought you here?
Absolutely. I love starting off actually with that of what gives me the precipice to be able to say or write a book called Trauma as Medicine. And to be honest with you, Guy, it all started with trying to figure out how to reconcile and heal my mother's homicide. And so back in December of 1995, my mother was brutally attacked by a stranger in the parking garage of her work. She was raped, her body was thrown into the back of her car and then into an abandoned farmhouse. And we didn't know what happened to her for about 11 days. And so, you know, in the acute times of trauma, we're obviously not contemplating or considering trauma as medicine. And those acute experiences, we're doing what we can to be with the impossible and the unspeakable. And that was very much a part of what I did in the first couple of years. Her perpetrator was found guilty of murder 1, and he suicided in prison afterwards. And so there was a part of me that really had believed up until that point, and I was 20 when she was murdered, that there was purpose and meaning in everything. I had seen myself on a very devout spiritual path at a young age. And obviously being struck with such a brutally traumatic experience makes you unpack all of your beliefs and ideology and start to question what is real, what matters, and investigate how to reconcile beliefs and ideology with what is authentic or true for you. And so that very much sparked and deepened my desire to heal, to pursue freedom at any cost. And so something I notice about trauma is that anything unresolved that we hold in our beings becomes like an energy cord or weight that really keeps us from feeling comfortable in being seen or showing up in our lives. And I was conscious of the feeling of that, and so spent a lot of time expressing emotions, listening to what that energy in my body was telling me and finding a means to release it. And back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of talk about trauma. You know, when I did have internet, it was dial-up. You know, so there wasn't a lot to research. So a lot of my journey came from going, what do I do? I need a different answer that what our culture says, and that what a lot of my family was doing, which, you know, to some extent was just putting the past down and trying to move forward, but not necessarily metabolizing what had come to pass.
Let me pause you here for a second.
Yeah.
I'm hearing what sounds like a woodpecker. You hear
Weird.
that?
No,
Okay. I'm imagining there's like a woodpecker outside somewhere. It's very
no.
interesting. I don't know if it's a
Um, maybe I have two possible sound things here. Maybe I'll just check. Um, does that make any difference at all?
yeah, I'm not hearing it now.
Okay. I have a speaker on my camera and a speaker in my
Okay.
system. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for sharing this.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you at that time or at a time were of the belief that everything has a meaning. Okay.
Yeah.
How did you use that as a framework to understand, digest, work through what
Yeah.
happened to your
Yeah.
mom? And did that
Yeah.
belief carry you through? Did you hold that belief?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Guy. And something that I even do in my book is unpack some of what, we often call those new ageisms, the there's no accidents, everything happens for a reason, and can those be true and not be a spiritual bypass? And that was very much a part of my journey. So I'd say first off, my mom was a life coach. And back in the 80s where nobody knew about life coaching. So I was surrounded by a lot of personal growth information at a really young age, and then I put it into practice before she died because I left home myself at about 15 years of age. So when she died, I already had this habit of listening to my intuition. I had already learned if I didn't listen to my intuition, there were consequences to that. And that the sensation I would get in my own body when I believed that there was purpose and meaning in what had come to pass gave me the sense of feeling uplifted and connected, and the sense I would have in my body of the futility of existence. There's no purpose, things just happen, gave me a really low feeling in my body. So I very much navigated according to sensory
Mm-hmm.
awareness. And of course, I was face to face with, yeah, okay, mom, everything happens for a reason. You were brutally attacked in your parking garage of your work. You believed everything happened for a reason. I mean, she had even had a funny feeling about the garage guy and started parking her car on the street 2 weeks before, but it had gotten
Wow.
broken into. And so she'd moved back to the garage. And so what happened in the couple of years after she died is that I had to make a choice. And that choice was, if it's true that everything happens for a reason, how do I then direct the focus of my own healing journey? What changes if I believe that? Because I can
Mm-hmm.
choose my beliefs.
Right.
So if I choose that belief and that resonates for me, what possibilities does that bring into my path, as opposed to this was a random act, this had no meaning or value, nothing makes sense. So it very much was a decision that I needed to make in my own body. And I feel like because I've had such a long-standing practice, Guy, with earth-based traditions, I would bring a lot of my self-inquiry outside in nature. And if we're walking through a forest and we look around at that forest and we see the old trees that have fallen down from lightning striking them, and the mycelium and the moss growing on top of them, there's nothing in that forest that doesn't belong. The part that's been struck by lightning has as much purpose and meaning as building healthy soil as everything else. And so that reflection became a really important metaphor for me and guided me on this quest, if you will, to metabolize and digest homicide and make peace with their perpetrator.
And I guess, we each have our own beliefs. I'm not here to judge anyone's beliefs. I'm just curious how you moved through that. So did you hold the belief that there was some meaning in here, or this was not random, this had a purpose in my life? Because I think it's one thing to adopt that belief, and it's another to say, okay, this was completely random. How do I move forward? How do I make meaning out of this?
Mhm.
So where did you fall on that
I would
spectrum
say
in a
that
sense?
I believe in both. To one extent, did Peter Bright Eyes plan going into the parkade that day? He was only out of jail for 5 days. You know, and the series of events that had to come forth in order for him to be that guy in the parkade were, infinite.
Right.
And so I would say that I believe that there's purpose and meaning in everything that comes to pass in our lives. And that we get to decide how available we are for that meaning. Like we get to, and that's a decision that we make inside of our own selves, of whether or not we bring our intention or our prayer, whatever the word is that you want to use, towards how we govern what shows up and how we allow our management of that to direct where we're moving in our lives. And so for me, because I've always seen my life as a profound spiritual experience, that my self-inquiry started to go, okay, if there's purpose and meaning in this, what does that mean for me in my life? And if there was some sort of reason as to why that guy was in the parkade that day, what could it be? And that started to lead me to explore his humanity and begin to be curious about the impacts of colonization in Canada and how the unresolved trauma from First Nations people spreads out and impacts everybody around us, because Bright Eyes was First Nations. And in
Bright Eyes was the name of the perpetrator.
the perpetrator,
Okay.
yeah. And so what I would say is the decision that there was purpose and meaning in it has led me on this really profoundly compassionate experience of not only understanding his humanity, which released me from any of the binding energy, on any of the suppressed energy relating to that trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in order to be curious about who he was as a human, I had to stop vilifying him. And this wasn't overnight. This was probably, it started around 10 years after my mom died, where I started to think, okay, well, who else was he other than a bad guy? He was someone's brother, son, and somebody doesn't just wake up one day and become a murderer. What had happened for him to be in the parkade that day? And that investigation led me to contact the chief and counsel from the band, which is it's a little bit different in Canada. That would be the area that was allocated for his people back in the late 1800s to live on. And I was put in touch with a former chief who I began to work with and start to learn about the history of colonization. And I was invited actually to come in and teach and do trauma as medicine circles. And so a lot of that learning, to go back to your initial question about purpose and meaning, if I hadn't decided there was some sort of value in her death, I wouldn't have been led to such a place that I never would have thought was possible. I mean, through the years, I even do talks on reconciliation with the sister of the perpetrator, where she shares her journey of overcoming addiction, and I speak about healing homicide. So it's piece by piece has led me forward into a really I guess what you call liberation, right? When you're no longer being bound or held down by what you're afraid of. And instead, it feels like everything that shows up becomes just another puzzle in the great tapestry of self-discovery.
Talk about trauma as medicine, the choice for that title. I'm curious about that. What does that mean for you?
For me, what that means, Guy, is that it's possible for us to derive something sustainable that feeds our body, mind, and spirit from the most innately horrendous experiences. So it's what we do with it that can cultivate medicine. We can also cultivate poison, right? We can
Mhm.
also be really stuck, which there's definitely times where I've had that experience, right? Allowing the fear of all the what ifs and all of um, the shock and the numbing and the horror and the reality of what horrible things humans can do to another can become the poison. It was my experience that somehow I had to learn how to digest that. And it was through the digestion that the medicine started to come forth. And the medicine for me would be compassion.
I mean, look, I admire you. I mean, no one who has not experienced, I mean, anyone who has not experienced what you've experienced can sit and speak what you've experienced. And believe me, I'm not
Yeah.
intending to do that. But by the same token, I think there are a lot of people out there who are like, what happened to your mother was horrific, sounds horrific, and what happens to many people who are, horrifically abused is
Mhm.
awful, period. But I think just to move forward, personally, I think to move forward, I have to find, I, I'm not saying, what happened to me horrifically in the past isn't awful, right? I'm not discounting that, but I am saying, and I think you're saying to a certain degree, to move forward, we've I've got to find some meaning in this. Otherwise, I'm going to
Right,
go nuts.
right, right. And that's it. It's the decision to choose something other than crazy. Because definitely it's so easy for our mind to perseverate over the details of abuse or violence and all of the little ways in which they impact us. Um, and we can get so stuck in that. And so I would say it's a daily practice too, that when we're wanting to move forward, um, I know I had to make sure I wasn't avoiding what happened. Like I had to go through her autopsy report. I had to go through every little bit
Mm-hmm.
and face that, um, you know, and let it out. And so that might mean look like going for a walk in the woods and screaming at the top of my
Mm-hmm.
lungs, like that, finding some sort of way. I really love embodied dance workshops for my own healing, and I often use them in the ones I teach, but like letting that energy out because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise it's going to hang out in there. So choosing the meaning doesn't mean that we're ignoring what was horrible. It means we're finding a way to be with it because horrible happens. As human beings, we're not going to get away from that,
Right.
right? I mean, look at our planet now. Look at
Right.
all of the different stuff that's happening, and how do we reconcile and be with these most uncomfortable, difficult experiences? And if we can do that from a place of finding meaning, we can move forward. And if we can find compassion for the other rather than hating them because they have hurt us or hurt someone we know, or they have different beliefs than us, if we can find compassion, we can find some sort of unification that will create a different focus and experience in our lives, and hopefully in our communities and our world.
How long did it take you to and define compassion within this context? Compassion for this perpetrator.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's a really good question, Guy. After about 10 years after mom died, I realized I'd never expressed my anger, right? I'd made excuses for all of the reasons why my anger wasn't important. And I also had little kids, and, I was managing being a mom. And so I couldn't find anyone to support me in expressing this anger. I tried. I went to see a therapist, and um, their approach just wasn't to go there. And so I thought, well, I got to figure out how to do this.
What do you mean? You mean people were like, how could you be angry at this person, or
Uh,
what?
what I told her was I was feeling angry and I could feel him around me all the time. And I knew that I could feel him around me because I needed to address that energy. And her suggestion was actually to imagine him being surrounded by a pink light
Mm.
or to see him slowly floating away in an air balloon. And honestly, I thought I could have got that for free from some of
Right.
my woo-woo friends. I
Right.
didn't need a psychologist to,
Right.
um, you know, how. So what happened from that is I decided to go home and create my own ceremony where I would take but an hour a day, once a week, and this lasted 9 months, where I would express my own anger towards him. And I had, a 6, 7 month old son that napped for an hour and a half in the morning and twin girls in kindergarten. I thought I had a lot of time. And in that 1 hour, I would get angry. I would write letters. I might drum on my drum, scream out loud, burn the letters in the fire, and go on a deep meditation. And so it was through the process of expressing my anger and my need for vengeance that I had a vision I wasn't expecting when I was in a deep meditation. And in this vision, Guy, I saw Peter Bright Eyes as a young boy. I saw him as my son, actually, in the vision. And initially, I was horrified by that. I pulled myself out of the deep meditation with a lot of expletives and swearing, thinking, how could I feel that? And then I felt ashamed. How could I tell my family I felt this compassion? And yet the compassion was true. So what I would say is that for some time, I sat with the energy of anger and compassion simultaneously. I actually felt like compassion was hijacking my anger because I thought, I'm doing this to get mad. And I still, over the course of the next few months, as I did self-inquiry and investigated any other energy around anger, I found a way to express it. And then over the course of the next few years, this compassion started to grow as a curiosity. And it was about 4 years after that initial experience of it that I contacted the Saddle Lake First Nation, which is where he was from, and ended up being put into contact with the former chief. And even then, that was in 2010, I still had to sit with what I was learning through the years because it didn't make sense to me. In our rational world, we don't have a lot of examples of this is how you be with compassion for a perpetrator. There was no, I couldn't find anyone to mentor me in that space.
Why
So,
was that
yeah.
important for you to find compassion for this person?
I would say that it kept coming up in my meditation, that the deeper I would go inward, I would feel this desire to understand who he was and why he was that person in the parkade that day, and how was that a part of the kind of greater collective experience, right? I believe in collective healing as well. I believe in us humans as one people. So how does that incorporate into the collective field of humanity, if you will? And so it was more like a knowing in my body. It wasn't as cognitive, Guy. It was more of like, I have to do this. I can't not do this.
Right. It would, again, I have not been in that position. My experience when I had an experience when I was a young kid, I was bullied for a while that really jacked up a lot of things for me. But it wasn't to the extent like this. And I'm thinking to myself, what is the relationship between holding or having compassion with this person and recognizing their horrific act, you
Yeah.
know, does is the goal here for the compassion to melt what
Right.
occurred?
Right.
Is it
No,
right?
no,
Because
they're
it
both,
can't.
yeah, it can't, like, even with forgiveness, one of the things that made me hesitate with forgiveness for a long time is I needed to know that forgiving did not mean I was saying it was okay, right? And neither does compassion. People are
What does it mean?
responsible
What
for
does
their,
forgiveness mean?
for me, forgiveness means that I was willing to accept the teachings that were inherent inside of this experience. So when I realized that as much as I didn't want this to be true, her perpetrator was one of the biggest teachers in my life.
Mm-hmm.
When I was willing to acknowledge that and accept that, and it came about unexpectedly. I was taking an energy healing training program, and I was outside in this big river valley making a mandala out of things in nature. And I had this strong awareness that he was one of the biggest teachers of my life. When you get one, you get shivers over your whole body. And I probably had a bit of resistance. I have this little punk rocker inside of me that every now and then she's like, that can't be true. And so there was a part of me that was like, no, but I knew it was true. And it
Mm-hmm.
is true.
Who is your book for?
Uh, my Aside from being a tribute to my mother and her legacy and her belief that there are no accidents and that she forgives everyone. I mean, she had an affirmation about forgiveness on her mirror. My book is for the people like myself who find themselves up against something that feels impossible to metabolize. And that's why it offers up journal questions and meditations and exercises so that you can integrate and practice yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not always for people who have had something big like murder. It can be experiences of feeling abandoned or betrayed or rejected that are still substantial throughout our life. So it can be little t trauma as well as big T. It's the feeling of being stuck and really wanting a way to integrate that so that you can move forward.
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. I'm really glad you came on here, Sarah, because I think on this podcast, I don't know if I've really had this discussion, because it's one thing, I think, to experience we're talking about a very personal attack in this instance, right? We're talking, and for those individuals who've been raped, and we're talking about this is not some asteroid that just came out of nowhere and killed your mom. This was something very personal. And in that, I'm wondering if you encounter people who've been raped and physically, personally accosted like this, who are like, get the F out of here. How am I going to feel compassion for this person? You must be on crack.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so whether I'm in my own clinic practice or if I'm teaching a program, it's always an invitation. Like each of us have to discern for ourselves what we need in our own metabolization of trauma, right? We all have to discern that. And so I would never suggest to somebody else, like, you've got to find compassion for your perpetrator, or you're not moving forward. Each of us have to discern that and come to our own place of knowing. And the truth exists inside of us. So that's more of the key cardinal piece, is what happens when we go inwards and we tell the truth of what we're feeling. And piece by piece, explore what that means for us. And so for some, it might be simply no longer feeling bound by the trauma. So starting to forgive or just let go. I've had a big talk with my dad about this because it's taken him some time to understand my journey. This was his wife, right? He has read my book though. And so part of that has been for him is more of this letting go. he doesn't ever want to find compassion for the perpetrator, and he doesn't need to for him, and that's okay. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that, compassion is having compassion for yourself too,
Mm-hmm.
and what feels right for you, and trusting in that. So I would never presume to assume or to know what each person needs on an individual basis. More to recognize when we have been raped, that energy is in our body.
Right.
And so we need to find the means to release the energy of that rape, and following the energy piece by piece to listen to what that means to us. What do I need today in this moment, to move some of this energy that is keeping me feeling trapped or stuck.
This reminds me about, I think, 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I remember I was working in a restaurant, and one of my coworkers told me that he had 8 friends who died of AIDS.
Mm.
And I said to him, "Oh my God, how the hell do you get through?" I mean, he said, "These were really close friends of mine, dear friends." And I said, "How the hell did you get through this?" And he said to me, he said, "I had to find meaning in it.
Right.
I had to find meaning in it." And that blew me away, because I thought, and I was like, how does anyone find meaning in this?
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your response, which was, we each have to find our own way.
Yeah.
To work through this, to move through this, because as we talk a lot about on this podcast, and as you just shared too, a lot of trauma is held in the body. And if it's not attended to, if the light of awareness, in a sense, is not shown on it, it will fester. Now, are you suggesting similarly that compassion is like that as well? In other words, if we don't find compassion, or if we don't work through compassion or bring it into our awareness, that there will be a block there. There will be energy there that's going to be fighting, always holding us, in a sense.
I think it arises organically, Guy. Like, I know for me, I never planned on the compassion. And when I've supported others and it's come forth, I think it's a natural consequence of going into the hate, going into the vilification, going into the pain or the grief, like the deep grief around loss, is that when we feel that, compassion arises naturally in the space that's next, so to speak. It's so hard, like, to put stages on anybody's grief, because it happens differently for each of us. And yet that's what I've observed or witnessed through the years, is that it can be a natural result of us going deeper into and metabolizing and releasing the really painful and poisonous experiences. And as you said, then and the meaning becomes a choice, which is unique for all of us. If we're here, and inevitably we're here on this planet, we need to decide, how do we want to live?
Right.
And what do we want that to look like?
Right. I really appreciate your perspective. And I think this is really going to be a needed episode for people to hear. Sarah, so the book is available, obviously, now on your website. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Go to sarahsalterkelly.com. So on my website is the best way. And they can also buy it on Amazon. So for those people who aren't in Canada, it's on Amazon, Trauma is Medicine. That's another way. And that's the best way. You can add me on social media, on Facebook or Instagram, just my name, Sarah Salter Kelly.
Okay. And then we'll have that book linked up at the show notes page at traumatherapistpodcast.com. What about any other go-to books or go-to book that you would recommend, whether trauma related or not?
I put some thought into this, and I think the most poignant one I would suggest is the Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu
Oh,
and
okay.
his daughter. Um, I don't want to pronounce her name wrong, but Mofo Tutu. And so Book of Forgiving is really beautiful. And Desmond Tutu's work in shared humanity has definitely provided me with a lot of mentorship and that recognition that we're not separate from each other.
Right, right. Awesome. Sarah, thank you so much for coming back here, for coming here. I'd love to have you back. So what I wanted
Love
to
to
say,
come back.
I think you have a lot to share, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy, for having me, and have an incredible rest of your day.
All right. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.